Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome again. I'm Scott Waterman. I'm a retired medical educator and student of authoritarian political movements. Karen Baum-Gordon and I are class of 1978 co-captains for Crimson Goes Blue, a growing community of over 3,000 Harvard alumni, faculty, and staff members who are working to protect our democracy. We have the honor of hosting tonight's event, HR 78, Preventing Election Subversion. Your presence this evening indicates an understanding of the circumstances we face as a country, but it also signifies an unwillingness to submit to pessimism or resignation, choosing instead to unite with old friends and classmates to help ensure that the backbone of American democracy, free and fair elections, is protected. In short, it represents a determination to defend what we believe is right. The program we have planned for you is intended to educate and to motivate, to inspire, and ultimately to activate. We will hear from Crimson Goes Blue co-founder and political director Janet Singer about the prognosis for Democratic victories in this year's midterm elections. Nick Brown, Harvard Law class of '02 and Attorney General of the state of Washington, will provide us an insider's view of how efforts will help AGs assure their constituents that every vote is worth casting because every vote will count. Sara Tindall Ghazal, who has orchestrated the efforts of the Democratic Attorneys General Association we are here to support, will share with us her considerable expertise on how elections are run, where they're vulnerable to forces that are hostile to democracy, and how those vulnerabilities can be mitigated through preparation. And our classmate and former Massachusetts Governor, Deval Patrick, will add his support and encouragement to this vital project. Now, it's self-evident that this program and all it entails couldn't have been presented without a great deal of help. Karen and I are indebted to many people, including the members of our outreach committee. In addition, our special thanks go to Lisa Ulrich, co-founder and managing director of CGB. Her tireless dedication, expertise, and patience have been exemplary. If our democracy survives the threats it now faces, many Americans will thank God. We'll thank Lisa.
I'm Karen Baum-Gordon, to some of you, Bomber from back in the day. And clearly, our poll is showing that we are more engaged than we were back in our Harvard days. And we are somewhat informed about the election subversion methods. Um, so along those lines of being more engaged, it was July 2025 when Scott originally called me to be co-captain with him for our class for Crimson Goes Blue. And honestly, the internal dialogue I had is there is no way. I am way too busy. I have way too much on my plate. I'm not doing this. And then the next day I called him and I said, you know what? I'm doing it. I was so compelled to do something in this environment when our very democracy is being threatened, to be engaged. And as I've said to some folks, is this 2026 or is it 1936? Um, so here's the thing. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does teach us. And we have learned you have to participate in making the change you want to see. And to me, this is the perfect recipe for me, for Scott, and I hope for each of you to actually do something. There's three components. One is in community with people. Two is to do something meaningful. And three is something that we actually can do. In community with people, I have to say, to me, this has been a gift because to connect with old friends, some of whom I've been in touch with through the years, but some of whom I haven't, and then to actually make new friends, it's been amazing. Even on the outreach committee, I mean, there have been more small world stories that I've experienced in connecting with even some of the new folks. And speaking of the outreach committee, those members we know, are responsible for most of you being here tonight. So we want to acknowledge each of them. And when I say your name, outreach committee member, Please just raise your hand. We don't know, maybe just the people on your page are going to get to see you. But I do want to acknowledge Tony Daher, Marty Gagliano, Tony Gittleson, Don Guiney, Mark Ruby, Kristen Lane, Kathy Manning, Renee Madelon, Dan McShay, Margie Montoto, Brian O'Connor, Larry Orr, Hillary Puritan Sammons, Susan Spitz, Rogelio Thomas, and Cynthia Young. So you probably all want to like chat and connect right now, but that's going to happen at the end. We will keep the Zoom room open after 9 o'clock uh, till about 9:30 for informal chatting. So there's the in community, there is the fact that this is compelling. We are doing something meaningful. It's foundational and fundamental. We can have all the democratic wins we want, but if the elections are not free and fair, it's for naught. So preparation is the key and prevention of election subversion. And lastly, it's attainable. So I hope you're all sitting down because we have already raised over $10,000 towards our $75,000 goal that we need to meet by mid-March. Now, it may not show that on the website yet because things are it's still catching up to what we have, but it's for real over 10. So thank you for your generosity, class of 78 already. And now is the official kickoff. So the donation link is in the chat. You can feel free to contribute whenever you feel so moved, but we are already well on our way. Also in the chat, please put your questions. We've reserved a bit of time after our speakers to be able to address those. We're going to start tonight with hearing from Deval Patrick. So, after all, he is the highest ranking elected official of our class, two-time governor of Massachusetts, as well as he was the U.S. Assistant AG for the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. Now, although Deval happens to be in Nairobi on business and it's the wee hours of the morning there, he was very eager to speak with all of us, and therefore Scott and I had the opportunity to interview him in advance. Rest assured, we're going to show you a few clips, but the full interview will be on the website in a few days, both as video as well as a transcript. Here's Deval.
I feel really, Scott, like we've been drifting toward this moment for a long time. You think about the hyper-partisan gerrymandering, you think about the unchecked amount of money in our politics and our policy making, you think about the ways that cynicism itself has been encouraged and fomented when it comes to political and civic life. And we are going out to engage people through tactics instead of through ideas. So I think we're at a place now where we have a competition of tactics rather than a competition of ideas. I think that's part of the formula for how we get a competition of ideas, as I was saying, rather than a competition of tactics. So attorneys general have a really important role in assuring that those tactics aren't the prevailing condition for voting. That people have a fair chance to express themselves through the ballot, and at a time when I think an awful lot of our laws and norms and sort of expectations around an open democracy are being challenged today, we've got to call on our state attorneys general to stand up for the essence of their job, which is to protect the rule of law. it's preparation. It's about practice. You know, I was in office when the bombs went off at the Boston Marathon, and we had a very broad-based, I think ultimately successful response because we practiced. And we didn't know that what we were practicing for would come in exactly the form it did, but we had some sense of the relationships, of the people we were going to need to call on, the other leaders, some sense of trust built before we had to confront the chaos of that crisis. And all of that is a part, and as well as some sense of what the sequence of decisions that would have to be made would be. So it's that old adage, practice makes perfect, right? So and you may not get it all perfect in the moment, but having some sense of where to start when the clock is ticking, I think is critical.
It's so exciting to see so many new people here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Janet Singer, one of the CGB's co-founders and the political director. I'm a nurse midwife and a lifelong election junkie. As a nurse midwife, I can relate to what Deval Patrick just said about preparedness. We practiced and practiced what we referred to as high-risk, low-frequency events. And that is what we all want to help raise funds for tonight. CGB, powered largely by a community of Harvard alumni volunteers, works to elect Democrats, protect the freedom to vote and the integrity of our elections, and fight authoritarianism. We organize our community to make strategic use of your time, your funds, and your influence. And we do it with a mixture of hope and urgency. Whether you're here to become an activist or deepen your existing work, CGB can be your home. Thank you to your class and especially to Scott and Karen for your leadership. Before we get to the main event, let's look at the political landscape we're in. We are all devastated by the serious threats to our democracy that we see unfolding every day under the Trump regime. We need to be able to hold together two opposing realities: that our democracy is in danger and we are in a favorable electoral environment for Democrats. House Republicans hold a narrow 5-seat majority. We only need to net 3 seats to take it back. We'll achieve this by focusing on about 35 of the most competitive races. The Senate is currently 53-47, so we would need to net 4 seats to have the majority there. We now have a plausible, if difficult, path to a majority, though it requires winning in some red territory. The country, however, is much bluer today than it was in November of 2024. The strongest predictor of midterm success is being the party out of power. Americans tend to vote for change. Democrats currently lead the generic ballot by about 5 points, an 8-point swing from 2024. Historically, this lead grows as the midterm approaches. A recent Fox poll shows Democratic support at 52%, the highest ever recorded for either party in this predictive metric, the previous high being before the giant blue wave of 2018. Trump's approval is deeply underwater. A recent Pew survey puts his net approval at -24, with fully half of the country saying they strongly disapprove of his job performance. The intensity of this opposition is not likely to fade. Trump is underwater by 32 points with women, 15 with men, 71 with Blacks, and 45 with Hispanics. Trump is underwater with every single age group, and he's at -16 with voters without a college degree, a group that fueled his earlier political rise. In the elections held in 2025, Democrats overperformed their 2024 numbers by an average of 13 points. In 2025, Democrats won because we had the right candidates in the right places at the right time, candidates who are perceived as genuine and fighting for the people. Democrats have found their footing by focusing on three issues: affordability, healthcare, and corruption. While favorable views of the Democratic Party stand near all-time lows, we hold a sizable enthusiasm advantage over Republicans. Our voters are more motivated to show up. On the redistricting front, Democrats have successfully neutralized the Republican gerrymanders. Now, how do you all fit into this landscape? Winning the House is our primary bulwark against authoritarian overreach, and winning big is the best way to guard against potential attempts to overturn elections. CGB will provide you with high-impact, evidence-based opportunities to donate and volunteer. You can find these in our emails, our newsletter, our new private Substack, and our website, which has a calendar, a strategy page, a list of all our teams and the team leaders. I hope you'll check it out. 2026 is the year we will raise money together, phone bank together, canvass together, and protest in the streets together. And we will be the visible opposition to the authoritarian overreach, using our collective talent and resources, starting with the Class of '78's Election Subversion Prevention Initiative. So now on to the main event. How do we create the conditions needed to ensure that the voters' desires result in the rightful winners taking office? Over the past 6 months, members of our Strategic Task Force on Election Protection conducted an intensive national review of the likeliest threats to our elections and how CGB might prevent election subversion. I'm going to introduce our two guest speakers for tonight. First up is Washington State Attorney General Nick Brown. Not only is he a 2002 graduate of the law school, he served in the Army and in the JAG. He was elected in 2024 and now serves as the chair of the Democratic AG's Election Protection Working Group. He and his fellow AGs play a critical role in protecting our elections, which I'll let him get into in a moment. It is now my pleasure to introduce former survivor contestant and Washington AG Nick Brown. I'm also pleased to introduce you to Sara Ghazal, who is the lead architect of the Democratic Attorneys General Association, DAGA's groundbreaking work to prepare and support attorneys general and their colleagues in the blue and purple states where Trump is scheming to subvert elections. One of the most inspiring parts of our work is to meet brave and dedicated activists like Sara and Nick, who live their values every day. We are thrilled to partner with them and with DAGA and to get you prepared to support this truly promising strategy. I will now turn it over to Nick Brown, and then Sara will follow to give us a civics lesson on election management, and then share why supporting and preparing attorneys general is one of the most effective ways to prevent election subversion. Nick,
Well, thank you. Thank you, Janet, for the introduction, and really just thank you all for being here tonight. It's been fun to just watch you guys connect with each other and that sort of spirit and energy as classmates and on this really important issue is pretty fun to watch. So thank you for having me on. And as Janet said, I'm a 2002 graduate of the law school and have been proud to be Washington's Attorney General since almost just over a year ago when I was elected in November of 2024. I started my legal career as an Army JAG lawyer, serving as both a prosecutor and defense lawyer, worked for the Department of Justice for many years as a line assistant U.S. attorney, served our governor of the Washington state, our prior governor, Jay Inslee, as his general counsel, and then had the honor of being appointed by President Biden to be the U.S. attorney for Western Washington before I made the really risky decision to step down and run for office for the first time in my life. But being attorney general is an incredible, incredible place to be. And I've been really proud to work with Sara and my colleagues across the country on what might be the most important issue that we're facing when it comes to the integrity of our election system. And given the environment that we're living in and the constant, really almost daily threats to our systems across the country makes this issue really important. So really thankful for you all to be here. Thank you for supporting DAGA's efforts. And we work with our affiliated C4 organization, the Progressive State Leaders Committee, PSLC, on fighting back against attempts to undermine our system. Janet has said a little bit, and Karen said a little bit already about the environment that we're living in this day and age when it comes to election protection. But really, what we've seen is that what we saw on January 6th was just the starting point for this administration's efforts to undermine confidence in our election. And we are seeing really a relentless flow of not only rhetoric, but direct actions by this administration to take control of state election systems, to undermine voter confidence, and really, we think, sort of the worst case scenario of not letting people vote fairly and freely in the elections that are coming up. We've seen attempts to take control of our voting systems through executive orders. We've seen attempts to federalize the National Guard and deploy officers all across this country. We've seen efforts to seize ballots in states, which Sara will talk specifically about, given her role in Georgia. We've also seen demands by the Department of Justice, an organization that I have a lot of reverence for, having worked there for many years, really demand absurd things from the states, our voter rolls, personal information of voters. And we're operating in an environment all the time. And, most recently with the president's remarks about nationalizing or taking over our voting systems, these are not normal times. And AGs across the country play unique roles. We have the opportunity not only to represent our state governments, to serve as the chief legal officers and chief law enforcement officers in our states, but we get to fight back against the administration in ways that, frankly, I don't think many other political actors have the ability to do. I've been the Attorney General for just over a year. I've sued the president 50 times in 52 weeks. And the good news is that we win the vast majority of those cases. It may not always feel like that, but we have a proven track record in our state, working collaboratively with our partners across the country, of getting temporary restraining orders, of getting preliminary injunctions, of convincing courts of the real unlawful, unconstitutional, un-American actions that we see from this president. And we feel pretty confident that if we prepare well, that we can be prepared for anything that might come with respect to voting and voter protection, because our track record is pretty impressive, I think. And when it comes to defending elections, AGs are truly on the front lines. I was really happy to be asked to be chair of this really important committee. We have representatives from every democratically led AG's office across the country. And they meet monthly with me and with Sara to try to plan and strategize and prepare, not only with ourselves, but with other stakeholders across the country who are organizing around voter protection issues. And in my role as a former United States attorney and graduate of the law school, a really unique perspective on the role that federal government can play to disrupt our elections. And being relatively new into office, I have the ability to focus on this and not worry about my reelection for a few more years. But this election protection working group really serves as the hub for most of our work when it comes to this issue. We have a parallel group for active litigation that's planning to ensure that those discussions remain privileged. But when I took over as chair of this group, we tried to revamp our working group and really focus on planning and preparation. We led a in-person simulation exercise when we met in Denver last year. We held what's called a red team exercise, where the AGs and our staff acted as election disruptors and tried to brainstorm all the ways that states would prepare if we are seeing some of the things that we're hearing from the administration. And that exercise was really eye-opening and sobering, but it was a good first step in our process to prepare for what we might be facing in the coming months. And holding that in person really helped us act on our feet and get collaboration at a different level. We have an exercise this coming May when we meet again that we're planning with Secretary of States across the country, and I think that'll be really, really important. This will be the first time that we work directly with our counterparts and clients, the Secretary of State's offices, in this context. And while we AGs can develop our legal strategies, we have to be working seamlessly with our clients, the state's chief election officers, to make sure there's no daylight between our law and our policy and the actions that they have. Um, we're pretty confident that we'll be able to defend our elections in the court, but it's also just really important that we win in the court of public opinion. We've seen how important it is to explain these issues to the public in ways that they understand, to try to be as transparent as possible about some of the attacks that we're seeing and make sure that the public does not stop voting, that they continue to participate in our democracy. And our work make us really continues all the way through preparation, through election day, and then to the challenges that we might face after election day. And I know when we get through this year, we'll be back at it in 27 and 28 because this is really, really important. And I would just say, as you think about ways for you all to engage, Janet's right. It's important to get back the House. It's important to get back the Senate. But I would just really encourage you all to think about and recognize the people that are at the front lines are your state elected officials in this effort. It is not always Congress. It is your attorney generals, it is the secretary of states, and that's why this work is just really, really important. Sara is much more of an elections expert and is going to share more, but I am really happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
There are some questions in the chat box.
Yeah, actually, we're going to have Sara speak, and then we're going to give kind of the collaborative time. Sara, you're up. Thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you so much, AG Brown. And I know that you have another obligation because between being a statewide elected official and on the West Coast, this is still part of your workday. So I really, it's been a tremendous honor working with AG Brown on this. And just like it's a tremendous honor to be with all of you here tonight. You're clearly an incredible, illustrious group, and you've been engaged with matters of democracy. And it's always a pleasure and honor to be part of the room with folks like you. Just so a little background on myself. I'm not an elected official, but I've been working with DAGA since January of 2024. So a little more than 2 years. Helping support attorneys general in preparing for election subversion, first in 24 and now looking at the midterms. I serve as senior counsel here, not Harvard. I'm an Emory Law alumna. I have a very long background in elections and democratization. The first half of my career was spent doing this overseas. I observed elections in Liberia and Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Jamaica, and actually the Cherokee Nations, working with former President Jimmy Carter for many years. I spent 2 years living in Liberia, helping them try to consolidate democratic institutions after their elections. I only turned to US elections once I saw a lot of the patterns of democratic backsliding appear here in the United States. And I went from working in the Middle East to working in Georgia as the first full-time voter protection director year-round, starting in 2018, ran for office, local office in 2020. Georgia's still a red state. Since 2021, I have served as the only Democratic member of the Georgia State Election Board. And that's what I do on the side. That's my volunteer job, which is why I spent part of last week sitting in my car and standing in a very cold parking lot at the Fulton County Election Hub, watching as the FBI was seizing hundreds of boxes containing 500,000 ballots and related election materials from 2020. So I'll take a couple of steps back just to give a much broader context for elections, election administration, and what we're facing. By the express language of the Constitution, elections are the responsibility of states. Congress can pass laws to set national standards, but states are where specific election laws and procedures are passed and carried out. And it's really the thousands and thousands of local jurisdictions at the county and municipal level where elections are really undertaken. The executive branch has no role in administering, overseeing elections. Election systems are considered critical infrastructure, but all that does is create an obligation to provide security support for state officials. History of voting in the United States has been a constant struggle to expand the franchise. From the early days in the Republic, where we saw white male landowners having the right to vote, to the 15th Amendment granting Black men the right to vote, 19th Amendment for expanding it to women. And every step of the way took a struggle, and there has been backsliding all along. Jim Crow represented institutionalized state-sponsored voter suppression with the end of Reconstruction, until the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act really expanded the franchise. And we are now in the midst of another regression of voting rights, with retrenchment in the fundamental right to vote at the state level, diminishing protections at the federal level under the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, recognized by our courts, and invidious discrimination at the local level. But as we are approaching the midterms in 2026, we are facing an entirely new and unprecedented threat, that the awesome power of the federal government under a massively powerful executive branch will be deployed to suppress voters and subvert election processes in states and localities, and the ones that didn't support the current administration. We are familiar with a litany of efforts that we've seen since 2020 to undermine the ability of voters to cast a ballot, such as voter purges, voter challenges, voter intimidation, threats to election workers. But now we have this overlay of the federal interference, and what that can look like is the Department of Justice filing suit in 23 states, 22 of them are Democratic-led, along with the District of Columbia, demanding access to unredacted voter rolls. The administration's attempt to expand a database that they say will identify non-citizens, when in truth it is extremely inaccurate, and it has targeted U.S. citizens who are being purged right now. Ongoing litigation backed by the administration that could upend congressional districts. It's in the Supreme Court right now. DHS-directed immigration enforcement, federalizing National Guard troops, just like A.G. Brown has mentioned. We expect possibly even the threat of active duty military forces that will likely be deployed in predominantly Democratic neighborhoods to suppress voter turnout. And last week, we saw federal law enforcement weaponized to punish a local election office and threaten retribution against people who stood against our president back in 2020. Just in the last days, Trump is threatening to take over elections. He can't do that. Speaker Johnson spreading disinformation about fraud just because of the way returns come in. We've got Steve Bannon pledging that ICE is going to be surrounding polling places, but he is also a notorious fabulist. These threats are severe, but they're not insurmountable. But it is going to take all of us working together, rowing in the same direction. And I want to make sure that I recognize here that there is tremendous legal work going on at every level. The Democracy Defenders Action Network is doing amazing work, and we couldn't do this without them. Trevor Potter's leadership and the Campaign Legal Center, amazing work. We are so grateful to have him as one of your classmates as a partner in this work. But as A.G. Brown said, AGs are in a unique position because they represent and defend the states themselves. Sometimes they are the only parties that have standing to defend or, in fact, object to federal actions that affect the state and state administrators and state administration as opposed to affecting voters. And they defend the state when it's being sued. I want to make sure folks understand that as well. We're not talking about a single election here. These are the midterms, which means we have hundreds and hundreds, well over 500 just federal elections, nearly 500 federal elections alone. These are all separate races. It's not like in 2020. It's not like in 2024 when we were all working to defend the presidential election. No, we're working to defend hundreds and hundreds of separate elections that are all going on at the same time. And many of these lie in deeply democratic states that have never been subjected to the sort of threats that we've seen in recent election cycles. So they don't have a long history of election subversion. They haven't developed the muscle memory to respond to these efforts. And that's one of the reasons that doing this work this year with this group of AGs and this group of secretaries of state is so important. And using the offices of DAGA and PSLC to make sure that everybody is coordinating. So what we're trying to do in May, as AG Brown mentioned, bringing together attorneys general, secretaries of state, communications, and legal staff. And we will conduct an election simulation exercise. And what that means is we'll be walking through a series of scenarios with the help of trained moderators and helping participants brainstorm appropriate legal and communications responses to different scenarios. Hopefully they won't happen, but these are like the high risk, just as Janet was describing. And we include both legal and communications response staff and develop those responses because disinformation is at the heart of so much of what we're seeing and so much of the strategy of subversion. Because if voters believe that there's something wrong with the process or believe that there's a risk to voting, they won't go out and vote or they won't trust the outcomes. And the adage that a lie makes it halfway around the globe before the truth can put on its shoes has never been more true in the advent of social media and AI-produced deepfakes. So it takes weeks of planning and preparation. Look, I'm going to give you an example of one of the scenarios that we walked through in 2024 to prepare for the election. So, for example, a county board defies a court order to certify election results. A small county board refuses to certify election results, citing conspiracy theories and unsubstantiated concerns about fraud. The winning candidate seeks and obtains a writ of mandamus ordering the board to certify the results. The secretary refuses. The secretary has interviewed in the case, but the board refuses. So what do you do? So this is the sort of thing that we will walk through, we will think through. There are additional injections, additional details, but by going through this scenario, the AGs and the secretaries of states, while they'll come up with responses on the fly, but this is the homework that they went home with, that their offices went home with. They needed to brush up on state law regarding the extent of discretion that local election officials have to certify. In some cases, some of these states actually changed their state laws to make sure that they closed loopholes that allowed discretion and made it a ministerial act. They considered issuing legal advisories to a local election officials, outlining their legal obligations, made sure that their teams understood the details of election technology so that they could counter this disinformation and these conspiracy theories about possible subversion that was happening. Determine whether a state law had allowed for hand recount. Some state laws prohibit it entirely. Some will allow it. Determine whether state law allows a chief election officer to certify a statewide election, even in the absence of a local jurisdiction. And I say this not because this is an issue. This is actually an issue now that most jurisdictions are prepared for, but this is the sort of homework and the follow-up work that will lead from a successful simulation exercise. It's not just to go in there and have fun. It's to identify those areas where there may be gaps in understanding, there may be gaps in the law. But this is what the exercise allows us to do. Many of the scenarios that we walked through in 2024 actually happened. But because we were prepared, it didn't disrupt votes. It didn't disrupt the election administration, like setting fire to ballot boxes, happened in Washington and Oregon. Bomb threats happened in Arizona. Late-breaking challenges to voters. That delayed North Carolina's Supreme Court race from being declared for 6 months, but they were prepared to litigate that. So this sounds like a big challenge, I know, but you need to understand that we are already winning these legal battles. The AGs stopped Trump's illegal executive order trying to take control of election administration. So far in the states that have reached the final court orders, we have stopped the DOJ's effort to force states to hand over their election rolls unredacted. And just this week, a couple of days ago, the Supreme Court rejected Republican and the DOJ's efforts to block California's redistricting efforts. So we know that we have the law on our side, and we're organizing to make sure that we're prepared. Can't do this alone. The surest way to secure an election outcome is to make sure it's too big to steal. There's a reason that the election administrator's creed for good luck, sort of the equivalent of the theater geeks break a leg, is high turnout and wide margins, because that's what bolsters legitimacy. And that's where everybody in this room can make a real difference. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Sara, thank you. That was like a fruitcake's worth of incredible knowledge. I feel like I was in law school 101, 102, 103 in 17 minutes. So there are a lot of questions in the chat about kind of, well, you're doing this, but what about Trump, essentially? And the one major question is like, what assurance do we have that he won't just take over the elections, given that he doesn't seem to care much about the strictures, the Constitution, you name it. And maybe, what can we do and how do we look at this effort as a bulwark against that?
Well, we know he's going to try, but we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. But we know he's going to try to he could send the FBI. One of the reasons that the FBI was able to successfully grab Fulton County's stuff, they were able to execute the warrant, is because Fulton County wasn't prepared for it. And I know this, and this drives me insane. They didn't have a crisis communications plan. They did not have attorneys ready to immediately go to court and object to the warrant. They didn't have an inventory of what was in those boxes beforehand. And that's why we're doing this preparation now, to make sure that our AGs are working with their local officials so that they will block this. And remember, like, the one piece of information that hasn't really come out is the field office, the special agent in charge of the Atlanta field office resigned the week before this happened. There are only so many people in so many jurisdictions and so many offices that are willing to fly in the face of the Constitution and fly in the face of courts. And they can't do it everywhere. It's just not going to work everywhere. And we know, because we know what they're prepared to do, and we're prepared to block it in the courthouse. And if it takes a Minnesota style standing in the streets to make sure that every voter feels safe walking in and out of that polling place, we know that will happen, because we know that that's what the American people are willing to do to protect our democracy.
Yeah. So one question is, given that this is in some ways the role of the state AGs, Jeannie asks, like, well, why do we have to create or raise private monies for this? And can you also just say, like, so this group is going to go to the mat to raise $75,000, but what actually is that money going to be used for?
That money is going to be used to get secretaries of state and AGs into a room and in a hotel in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because this is, while the work that they're planning and the work that they are going to execute is part of their official duties, they can't use state monies to come to a partisan engagement. This is run by DAGA. This is PSLC. So that is a partisan activity. And I remember seeing somewhere in there, it's like, why don't we do this in a nonpartisan? There are nonpartisan efforts. There is a group called NAG, which is the National Association of Attorneys General. They are doing some of this. But I will tell you, living in a red state with a red state AG, they are not going to play in the same room. They are not going to go through these scenarios. They are not willing to countenance the fact that people in their party are willing to completely just set the Constitution on fire. And could you imagine trying to do this with Chris Kobach out of Kansas or Ken Paxton out of Texas? We don't want to give them ideas, quite frankly, because they're part of the problem. They're not going to be part of the solution, that's for sure.
Great. Janet, I want to give you the chance to kind of hit us the home run, which is to give a tiny bit more context about how CGB is looking at efforts to support or prevent voter suppression and protect voting before we give the floor back to our wonderful co-hosts. Sara, thank you. And I just really want to celebrate you because you are living your values and I think really doing groundbreaking and creative work. So just want to appreciate you for that. Okay, Janet, take us home, and then we're going to turn the floor back to Scott and Karen.
I'll give you the 1-minute version. I mean, I think we have to do everything to help voters vote. So that's a start. And whether that's getting people to vote early, so there's no chance their vote won't get counted. We have a very large voter protection team. I saw Karen Dash in the room. She's one of the co-leaders, and I think Hillary Klein is here as well. That team recruits people to be on voter hotlines, to cure ballots when ballots have been cast but not counted. I think this election, we will be at the polls, and we'll be at the polls observing as we've always done. But I think there's also going to be a real effort to have, and don't laugh at this, but to have parties at the polls in the way that the protests in Portland, Oregon, where people were in frog costumes dancing, it's really hard to call in the military or ICE while people are out protecting people's right to vote. And so I think we will also be developing strategies as we get closer to the elections when we see where are the places that are going to be most likely to be targeted. But it is an all-team effort. And I think everybody needs to be thinking about where are you going to be on election day and a couple weeks before that when early voting is happening so that we can do everything we can. And then finally, we have our Crimson Goes Blue portfolio. So this effort is one project we're funding, but we are also always funding candidates, and we are also always funding a grassroots group or some legal group that is defending elections. So that is always part of our portfolio. So money, time, helping everybody who can vote. I think those are our big things.
Wonderful. We're going to ask our co-host to take us home, but I will let you know that there have been some great questions in the chat, and we are going to continue to enrich the FAQs in the portal where you can give. So we're constantly thinking, I want to be responsive to the kinds of things that are on your minds. So with that, I'm thrilled to reintroduce Scott and then Karen to close the evening, but really begin the project, I would say. Scott.
Thank you again, Lisa. Our class arrived in Cambridge just a month after the end of what we assumed would retain the distinction of being the most corrupt presidential administration in our lifetimes, if not in our nation's history. We were mistaken. But could we have imagined that just over half a century later, we would convene a significant segment of that entering class to engage together in an effort to save our constitutional republic from election subversion and its consequences? I hope you're finding this as gratifying as I know Karen and I are. We're indebted to tonight's wonderful and dedicated presenters. We're leaving this meeting, as you heard, with good reasons to believe that the Democrats can win these upcoming midterm elections. But that will only happen if those elections are free and fair, and that in turn will depend on the preparation of the state's attorneys general to counter the subversion efforts we know will be mounted. And that is why we're all here tonight, to ensure that they have the resources needed to engage in that preparation. And so with that, I will turn it over to my co-captain and good friend, Karen.
Thank you, Scott. So I bring us back to thinking about that recipe I mentioned. For each of you, think about it. We are in community. This is something incredibly compelling. It's like insurance that the elections will be free and fair. And think about where that fits in your giving this year. And we can do it. Now, trust me, this is not what Scott and I do for a living to ask people for money. In fact, it's the antithesis of what we do. But this has brought Scott and me out of the woodwork to make an ask. So I'm happy to tell you that hot off the press, even during this call, we have raised almost $5,000 more. So we're now at $15,000. Now, you may be in a position or mindset to make a sizable gift of 1,000, 2,500, even 5 or 10,000. But for each of you, whatever it is, any amount that you find meaningful is what we would hugely appreciate. More importantly, not to be too dramatic, but our democracy would appreciate. By Tuesday, we are going to send out a letter with the highlights of tonight, as well as a link to the recording of this meeting. And we're also, yet again, at this moment, putting the donation link into the chat. This can be a legacy of our class. We have 5 weeks, and I think we can do this. So please go to that donate button today, tomorrow. And it's your opportunity to say yes and get engaged in this. As we all know, and as Deval mentioned to Scott and me, and you can hear it in his comments, we have a responsibility to leave things better than we found them. And part of that is helping to make sure that our democracy will succeed. So thank you all. We are so grateful that you have joined us tonight. If you don't want to go away yet, we can keep we are keeping the Zoom room open for those of you who would like to just chit chat and reconnect. But really, thank you all for giving us this hour tonight and for listening to our amazing speakers.